At 65, Jean-Claude Van Damme has stirred a quiet storm, not with explosive accusations or dramatic revelations, but with something far more unsettling: restraint. In an industry that thrives on noise, spectacle, and carefully curated narratives, his decision to speak in fragments rather than full explanations has created a different kind of impact. When he suggested that people had misunderstood Chuck Norris, he didn't just challenge a public image. He disrupted decades of collective belief. And what makes it so powerful is precisely what he didn't say. Because silence, when placed next to a legend, has a way of amplifying every hidden possibility. For generations, Chuck Norris existed as more than a person. He became a cultural force, a symbol so exaggerated that it blurred the line between reality and myth. From his martial arts mastery to his roles in films and shows like Walker, Texas Ranger, his image was built on unwavering strength, discipline, and moral certainty. Over time, the internet elevated that image even further, transforming him into a near-supernatural figure through jokes and viral facts that painted him as invincible. But myths come at a cost. The stronger the illusion, the more fragile the truth behind it becomes. Van Damme's perspective is shaped by something rare in Hollywood: shared experience at the highest level. Before fame elevated them into global icons, their connection was grounded in something much simpler and more human. In the early days, Van Damme was not a rival but a newcomer, someone trying to find his place in an unforgiving environment. Norris, already established, played a role in that early journey. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't equal. But it was real. And that foundation makes Van Damme's later reflections carry a different weight, because they don't come from an outsider looking in, but from someone who has seen both the rise and the reality behind the image. As Van Damme's own career surged, especially after films like Bloodsport, the dynamic inevitably shifted. What was once mentorship became competition, even if it was never openly declared. Hollywood has a way of turning parallel success into silent rivalry. Two figures occupying the same space, appealing to similar audiences, inevitably become comparisons in the eyes of studios, fans, and media. Yet beneath that perceived rivalry, there was something more complex, an unspoken understanding of the pressures they both carried. Because being an action star, especially in that era, wasn't just about performance. It was about embodiment. They weren't simply actors playing strong characters. They were expected to be those characters at all times. Strength wasn't a role, it was a requirement. Vulnerability wasn't hidden, it was unacceptable. And over time, that expectation becomes internalized. It shapes not just public behavior, but private identity. This is where Van Damme's reflection begins to shift from storytelling to something more introspective. His suggestion that Norris was misunderstood isn't about correcting facts. It's about redefining perception. According to him, the world saw a figure of unbreakable power, but failed to recognize the cost of maintaining that image. Years of physical strain, accumulated injuries, and the natural wear of time are realities that no amount of discipline can erase. Yet for someone like Norris, acknowledging those realities publicly would mean contradicting the very identity that defined him. And that contradiction is something Hollywood has always struggled to accommodate. The industry thrives on continuity, on keeping its icons frozen in the versions that audiences fell in love with. Aging, decline, and change don't fit neatly into that framework. So instead of being integrated into the narrative, they are often excluded from it. Not through explicit censorship, but through omission. Through a gradual fading from visibility, where the absence of new appearances becomes a substitute for confronting reality. Van Damme's account hints at this kind of absence, not as a dramatic conspiracy, but as a quiet pattern. Fewer roles, fewer public appearances, fewer moments of visibility. Not because the person ceases to exist, but because the image no longer aligns with what the industry wants to present. And in that space between presence and absence, something important gets lost. What makes this particularly striking is the contrast between public perception and private experience. The world continues to celebrate the legend, replaying old films, sharing exaggerated stories, reinforcing the myth. Meanwhile, the person behind that legend moves through a very different reality, one that is rarely acknowledged, let alone understood. Van Damme's reflections seem to bridge that gap, not by exposing details, but by inviting a shift in perspective. There is also an emotional dimension to this that goes beyond fame or legacy. At its core, this is about identity. When someone spends decades being seen as a symbol, it becomes difficult to exist outside of that role. The expectations don't just come from the outside, they become internal pressures. The need to live up to an image, to maintain a certain standard, to avoid showing anything that might contradict the legend. Over time, that can create a kind of isolation, not physical but psychological. Van Damme's words suggest that this isolation is one of the least visible yet most significant aspects of being an icon. Surrounded by admiration, yet disconnected from genuine understanding. Celebrated, yet not truly seen. It's a paradox that defines many public figures, but becomes especially pronounced in those whose identities are built on extremes like invincibility. And this is where the audience plays a role, whether intentionally or not. The demand for perfection, for consistency, for larger-than-life personas doesn't originate solely from the industry. It is reinforced by the way people engage with these figures. The reluctance to accept change, the preference for nostalgia, the discomfort with seeing strength replaced by vulnerability, all of these contribute to the maintenance of the illusion. Van Damme's decision to speak, even in fragments, challenges that dynamic. It suggests that there is value in acknowledging reality, even when it disrupts the narrative. That respecting someone's legacy doesn't mean preserving them in an unrealistic form, but recognizing the full scope of their experience, including the parts that don't fit the myth. At a deeper level, this story reflects something universal. The tension between who we are and how we are perceived. The pressure to maintain identities that no longer align with reality. The difficulty of letting go of roles that have defined us for so long. These are not challenges unique to celebrities. They are human experiences, amplified by visibility but not confined to it. In that sense, Van Damme's statement resonates beyond Hollywood. It becomes less about Chuck Norris as an individual and more about what he represents. A reminder that even the strongest images are constructed, and that behind every constructed image is a person navigating the same fundamental realities as anyone else. The unsettling nature of this story doesn't come from hidden scandals or dramatic revelations. It comes from the quiet realization that the truth is simpler, and perhaps more uncomfortable, than any conspiracy. That the legend was never false, but it was never complete either. And maybe that's what Van Damme meant all along. Not that the world was wrong to admire Chuck Norris, but that it stopped too soon. That it chose to admire the symbol without understanding the person. That it celebrated strength without acknowledging the cost. In the end, the most powerful part of this story isn't what was revealed, it's what was implied. A shift from myth to humanity. From invincibility to acceptance. And from silence as concealment to silence as something that invites reflection. Because sometimes the most profound truths aren't the ones that are fully explained. They're the ones that leave just enough space for us to question what we thought we already understood.